We're starting a series today called DNA, and it's going to be short. We just went on a 21 week. We're going on a 4-week, it's just 4-part series to take this journey through leaning into the unique fabric of our mission and our culture here at Real Life Church. Now, we're going to, throughout this 4 weeks, talk about more in depth mission. I can't wait. We're going to talk about what it means to be an equipping center, an equipping place, what it means to raise up believers, what it means when we say whole people, what do we mean when we say inner healing, and how in the world do we walk out inner healing? I believe it's one of the most important things that is needed for the body of Christ is more conversations on practical spiritual formation. What does it actually mean to look like Jesus? How can he take this part of me that is so angry and find the root and heal it so that out of that place flows his nature rather than mine? So we're going to talk about that on that week, and we're going to hear some testimonies of healing on that week. And then we're going to talk about whole world and what it means to represent. So I'm excited for all of it. But before we get into the specific mission, today we just want to talk about what it means to be an apostolic house, what it means to be a missional church. And specifically, I want us to look at, with our theme of embrace, fully what it means to fully embrace our prophetic call and mandate to this city and this region. Before there was a mission statement, there was a prophetic word. And our journey begins in 2012. Our mission statement of raising up whole people for the whole world, that really came to us in 2017. In 2016, we began to get the core understanding of this strategy that we had of building each life from the inside out. And then in 2017, we got clarity of how does this look for us? And in 2017, here it is. We're going to raise up whole people for the whole world. But we had been functioning years before that. And before the Lord gave definition to any of that, he gave this prophetic word, this prophetic utterance to us that really is the fabric of who we are. Our mission is what we've been sent to accomplish, but our DNA is what we carry to accomplish our mission. Our DNA is who we are. It's the fabric of our identity as a community, and it's the prophetic mandate that he's placed upon our house. In 2012, Elizabeth and I were 20 years old, and a year and a half, 2-year-old church launch, a Baptist church called New Birth Missionary Baptist Church that we were a part of launching along with Latanya, along with Dontre, Darius, along with a few others that may be in the room, and along with a senior leader. We launched that. Now, going into a year and a half, that senior leader took up the responsibility of a congregation away from Claremore. And it was in that season that the church fell in our hands, and the Lord had called us to continue to lead this work. And pastoring was the last thing that I ever wanted to do. I wanted to do things for the kingdom, but it was never pastoring, and that's how God works. And so I said, Lord, I remember telling people that I'll never pastor a church. I see myself pastoring a church. Notice that I said I'll never pastor a church, and the Lord, in his humor, said, cool, I'm going to make you do it at 20. And you know, that's him sometimes. He can do that because he's God, and that's what he did to us. And so in 2012, we began this journey. And before there was a mission statement, it was an encounter with the Lord where the Lord showed up to me and spoke to me and said, it shall be, and this is what we're focusing on today, this word, that it shall be a house of worship, a house of prayer, and a house of revival. And at 20 years old in 2012, I began to see what he wanted to do in the city. And it was interesting. And if I hear him accurately, what he wants to do in this city is beyond our imagination. And then he sent a prophet about 6 months after that to Claremore with the word of the Lord for the city. And I needed that because I needed to make sure it just wasn't my own personal zeal. I have a church and Lord, you're going to move in the city. I just put it on the shelf. And this prophet came And we spent the entire day together, and he confirmed that there would be something that launches and starts and began and is birthed here in Claremore and begins to spread into Tulsa and begins to spread through Oklahoma, out of Oklahoma. But there's this starting thing that he's going to do in this city. And if you have eyes to see, you always are aware when God is moving. What seems like a pandemic to some in birth depression is actually a move of God to others in birth a fervency and a passion. In 2020, the Lord told us, the first day of January, for those that gathered in that solemn assembly in Tulsa, what he told us before a pandemic was, I'm getting ready to declutter my church. I'm getting ready to do something. And I preached that word, and it was like, yeah, declutter. But we had no idea how he was going to do that. But we're still in the process of him decluttering his church, because he said that I want Jesus to be visible again. We can hardly see Christ in his church anymore because we have too much. So he's having this conversation with us about priorities. So before anything began, he said, this is who this house is, that you are called to be a house of worship, a house of prayer, and a house of revival. I believe that's on the screen. If you could flow with me on that up top, a house of worship, a house of prayer, and a house of revival. And what I want to do today is I want to take time and talk about revival culture. And I want to now take a few minutes and talk about what each of these aspects mean in the fabric of our DNA. So let's begin here on the screen with point number one. What does it mean to be a house of worship? Everybody say house of worship. Now, our understanding of worship has evolved since 2012. When the Lord gave us the word, we understood it based upon our level of understanding of worship then. And our understanding of worship will continue to evolve as we go along. But when we're talking about a house of worship, we're not just talking about a house that sings a lot. We're not just talking about a house that has good music. Go to that church, they have good music. That's not a house of worship. Hollywood has good music. Come on. The movies you just watched last week has good music. So worship is not just good music. Worship is not just singing a lot. When we say we're a house of worship, it doesn't just mean that we have a cool worship team.
Well, we do. That's right.
We do. I mean, y'all all right. But that's not what it means to be a house of worship. Because we have to go back to the definition of worship. Worship is not singing. Worship is not a song. That is an expression of worship, but worship is all in adoration. Worship is all adoration. It's reverence. It's adoration of the perfection of God. It's standing in awe of who He is. And it's continuously being drawn deeper into deeper levels of awe. Now, if we think that our minds could ever comprehend His goodness and His majesty, we have a broken theology. But because we don't at Real Life Church, we understand our minds are never going to comprehend. Even Paul says in 1 Corinthians that you can prophesy and you can do it, but without love it's pointless. And he says we know in part. So with all the prophetic words we have and all the revelation we have, we only know the half of this thing. And there's so much that we're not going to know until we're on the other side standing before Him. So because of that, because we constantly grow in our understanding of who He is, what happens is our worship should continuously evolve in our house individually and as a corporate body. So what this means is that true worship is a heart posture. It's a heart posture of adoration that expresses itself in a lifestyle of holiness and surrender. Holiness is easy for those who see God rightly. Because holiness is not task-oriented. Holiness is the natural response of worship. And what we say in our worship is, you are worthy of me changing whatever I need to change. You are worthy of me pursuing righteousness. Your way is greater than my way. You are holy and you are perfect. Everything outside of you is death. You are the source of life. Therefore, I'm committing the entirety of my life to conform to look like what you look like. That naturally flows out when the heart is postured in worship. True worship is not singing. True worship is defined by the priority we place on God in our lives. So there can be those who come in here and jump and dance and celebrate, and that's amazing. We want you to do that. But if you leave here and Monday through Friday, there's no time to pray, you haven't gotten in your word, you haven't spent time with Him, then you are singing, but you have yet to tap into worship. Worship is not defined by our song. Worship is defined by our heart posture. And that heart posture is defined by the place that God has in our life. Now, if we're going to talk about worship, we have to talk about the starting place of worship. The starting place of worship doesn't begin with worship. Here's what I need you to know, and this is a good point to write down. Worship is a response. Okay? Worship is a response. And the starting place of worship is a right perspective of God. When we see God rightly, worship is the automatic response. I'm telling every human being on the planet, if every human being sees God rightly, worship is the natural response. So it's not a matter of who's worshiping, who's not. It's a matter of a right perspective of God. A.W. Tozer says this. He says, what comes to mind when you think of God is the most important thing about you. What comes to mind when a person thinks of God is the most important thing about them. So when we're talking about being a house of worship, it begins with being a people who see Him for who He truly is. And as we see God for who He truly is, worship will arise. Now, because we're called to be a house of worship, there's this grace that God has and will continue to put upon us to present God rightly. That's a mandate. The world's perspective of God is broken, and I would venture as far as saying the church's perspective of God is broken. Do you know what inner healing looks like more than anything else? Seeing God for who He really is. The willingness to unravel your own perception of who He is. And where was He when that happened? And what healing looks like is a journey of seeing God rightly. That is a grace that will rest upon the house. Is we are anointed to unteach probably more than we are to teach. The majority of my ministry is not teaching people something new. It's breaking the bad things that they shouldn't have learned in the first place. It's the unlearning process that we are in so that we can get to a place of seeing God for who He is. Now, as we see God for who He is, what am I saying? I'm saying how you build a house of worship isn't, come on, if we jump, they'll jump. We don't want a house of jumping jacks. We want a house of worship. It's not just about excitement. It's not just about... So how do we build a house of worship? How do we get God's people to worship? And you can Google and find strategy after strategy. Do you know what the strategy is? To see God rightly. Mm-hmm. If God in all of His glory stepped into this room and we all seen Him, we would fall on the floor. See, people can look at someone's worship and say, it don't take all that. Cool, but if God showed up and you seen Him, you would fall over as if dead. So I can never judge that because they may see a portion of God that I have not encountered yet. So what does it look like to be a house of worship expressed? It's three things. I could have gave you 33 things, but we don't have time. I want to highlight these three things. It looks like consecration. It looks like deep surrender. It looks like vibrant worship. Number one, A house of worship expressed looks like a house of consecration. If we've ever needed consecration before, it's right now. Consecration means to be set apart. It means that as a believer, you are no longer of this world. You've been called out of the world. You've been called to repent and turn from all things outside of Him, every form of sin, and to live in this place of consecration, live in this place of separation unto Him. I remember one time the Lord showed me this vision, and in His hand there were rocks. And one of the rocks transformed into an arrow. And I seen the hand of God take the arrow and put it in a bow and shoot it. And He says, there's very little things in the earth more powerful in my hand than a consecrated one. And He began to have this conversation with me is I can't send you until you're consecrated. I keep you in my hand as a stone, and you got rough edges, you got round edges. But no one other than probably David could pull it off, right? He didn't need an arrow. Other than him, let's take him out of the conversation. We're not going to shoot there's an arrow, there's a point, there's a destination. And so we are in the hand of God as believers, but let me tell you this, you can live and die and not fulfill the potential of what He placed upon your life. And the most important component of you fulfilling that potential as a believer has nothing to do with your degree or your education. It has nothing to do with your skill level. Ask the 12 that He chose. He didn't choose the scribes and the Pharisees. It has everything to do with the depth of your consecration. There's nothing more powerful in the hand of God than a consecrated one. One that would say, I am in the midst of a corrupt generation, a perverse time that we are living in, but I am going to make the decision to live a life separated unto your name. And what a house of worship looks like, it looks like consecration, because everything in the natural translates into the spiritual. So you can see in the natural, you can see in the spiritual. You can hear in the natural, you can hear in the spiritual, right? You can smell in the natural, you can smell in this. Things have a fragrance. Sin has a fragrance. Flesh and carnality has a fragrance. Demons have a fragrance. Can I tell you that consecration has a fragrance? And I remember when I began to smell the fragrance of consecration, I said, Lord, I want my life to be marked with that. I want my life to be marked with that. What a house of worship looks like, it looks like a generation and a group of people within a generation who are pursuing righteousness above everything else. What it also looks like is deep surrender. We have found the worthiness of God. When we see Him rightly, we don't hold on to anything. When we see Him rightly, we see that He is worthy of my surrender. And in a house of worship, there will be this deep sense of surrender. The last thing in a house of worship, there will be vibrant worship. Everybody say vibrant worship. There'll be a place that we don't hold back, but we're not trying to, right? We're not trying to. This is the natural response. Why? Because we're growing in our perception of who He is. We're encountering His holiness. We're encountering His perfection. And the more that we do that, it's hard to stand in worship. Are you with me? It's hard to stand when I see Him rightly. My response is to bow. Listen, when I see His holiness, my response is to bow. Why? Because Beatitudes, I'm experiencing what it means to be poor in spirit. When I see His goodness, my response is this. Are you with me? When I see that He is worthy and that I should not be holding on to anything in my response is this. So vibrant worship is not we're trying to work. No. We're just rightly seeing God. We're encountering for who He is. And as a result, it births itself. It expresses itself in worship. Can I tell you, number one, we're weird for Claremore. For 10 years, I was thinking, do we belong here? Do we belong here? And for 10 years, it was like, we don't belong here. We do not. People do not like this. But early on in that journey, we always felt this sense of we're too much. The worship is too much. And we used to get those comments, this is too, it don't take all that. And for the first few years, we're like, you're right. We're not going to be received in this area. Dontre, hey, good worship, but if you don't stop jumping up and down, we aren't going to, they don't like us. Chill on the keys. Don't jump. Don't do the bouncy thing anymore, right? We've had all of those conversations, but then we reached a place where we say, you know what? We are denying the fabric of who we are. Yes. God has created us to be a house of worship, and even when we try to run from it, we can't. It's always going to be the nature of who we are. Dontre's always going to bounce. He's always gonna do it. But I don't know about you, but I want to go deeper in it. I want to be in worship gatherings to where we can't even get up off the floor, and this imperfect human being can't even approach the microphone because God is in the room right now. They don't need to hear me. Now, when you have a culture of worship, we can do that and no one would be upset. When you don't have a culture of worship, we're so reliant upon a preacher. Do you know that if we're not in a culture of worship and that worship culture is not established, do you know I would get hung if I didn't preach? I drove all this way for a good sermon. Would you rather just encounter him? Have we come this far that you need another motivational speech? Is it okay that we lay before a holy God and truly encounter him for who he is? And if he is in the room, is it okay that no human does anything? But stillness is foreign in our church services because we don't know what to do with stillness. But when we rightly see him, we don't need a lot of stuff. We should be so overwhelmed on our knees saying, God, you are so good. You are so good. You are so good. And this is a practice that you now, okay, this is not. My wife leaned over and said, hey, just because you're starting early doesn't mean you have more time. It's just, so I'm not going to say what I was going to say. Move on. Now, everybody's worship will look different. It doesn't mean everybody has different temperaments. It doesn't mean that everybody encounters him by jumping. It doesn't mean that. Because the person in the back who's doing this could be in the depth of the throne of God, encountering him in such a miraculous way. You don't have to see that or notice that. But what I'm saying is worship is a response, and it's okay for that response to flow out of that revelation of who he is and be vibrant and be life-giving. Because the same ones that say, well, no, I just don't have vibrant worship. When we're talking about vibrancy, we're really talking about authenticity. We're talking about you're responding to the glory that you see. It's not just singing the words on the screen. It's not just lifting my hands, but I'm responding to something that I'm singing is evoking this. Because the same people say, I don't have vibrant worship. I would say that's interesting because you're vibrant at the football games. The same person says, well, I don't know. It's just not my thing to clap, but you clap on the touchdowns, though. Why? Because your eyes seen something good, and that goodness evoked a response. Can we stop beating around the bush and just acknowledge that you see your sports team better than you see a holy God? That's just all that is. And the more that you see him rightly, and the more that your eyes gaze upon him, you're telling me that your eyes can look at Curry beat the three-point record or MJ do something. You're telling me, don't mind him, you're telling me that your eyes can look at humans score a touchdown and that evokes you to jump up, get excited, and scream. But when you come into a worship environment, you can't say a word. Worship is a response to what we see. So in a house of worship, all we do is we hunger and we say, okay, I want to see him more. I want to see him more clearly, that it brings authentic worship out of me. Again, that doesn't mean that we all have to run. It doesn't mean that we all have to, get in that bunny anointing that Dontre gets. He gets the bunny anointing. He gets a bunny and it hits his life. It doesn't mean that everyone's going to worship in their temperament. But what we're saying is that should grow deeper and deeper. It should be more expressive, more expressive. Okay, house of prayer. Everybody say house of prayer. What does it mean to be a house of prayer? Isaiah 56 verse 7, let's read it, is on the screen. It says this: these I will bring to my holy mountain and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Do you see that up there? Isaiah 56, their burnt offerings and their sacrifices will be accepted on my altar. Listen to this: for my house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples. Now, we understand that Jesus comes in and he sees them selling things in the house of God, and we understand the story. He starts, this is my favorite thing to read about Jesus, right? It gives me permission to act up every now and then. He comes in and he's flipping the tables over, and he's making a whip. He's burning with zeal for the house of his Father. And he says, you guys have turned this into a den of thieves. You guys have turned this into a purpose, and this is not the purpose. My Father said through the prophet Isaiah that this should be a house of prayer for the nations. This is Jesus's heart for his church. Now, we understand that prayer is the fuel of the kingdom. Prayer is the fuel of the kingdom. Everything in the kingdom runs on prayer. Well, things ain't changing. They're not. They're not. Just from hopeful wishing that you don't pray enough for things to change. Come on. Let's just be honest. I just don't know. You ain't. It's going to be the same. 2022 is going to look like your prayer life. And if the prayer life doesn't shift and that doesn't change, then it's going to look like 2021. Prayer is the fuel that changes everything in the kingdom. You cannot do one thing in the kingdom except it be produced from the place of prayer. Everybody say house of prayer. Prayer is the number one priority of the kingdom, and everything flows out of it. I want to give you two aspects that what it means to be a house of prayer. And let me tell you, we're not there yet. I believe that there's prayerlessness in our region. I believe there's a slothful spirit, spiritually slothful spirit in our region. I believe that the church is trying to wake up out of the grave and we still have our grave clothes on. And I believe in 2022, as the Lord began in 2020 to declutter his church, he's going to start to unravel his church. And what we're going to experience is the Lord awakening us out of our slumber, because the church has been asleep for a long time. We've been slothful for a long time. And we think this is normal until you read Acts. You say, wait a minute. This is not normal Christianity. It's not normal for all of us to be defeated every week and limp our way back into here on Sunday, sing a few songs, and then not have time to read the word. This is not normal. We see normal Christianity in that which Jesus established. We see normal Christianity in the book of Acts. Is anybody going through the Bible reading plan? I want to throw my Bible every time I read Acts, because the gap between how they function and where we are is such a large gap, I can hardly stand it. And sometimes I feel like I'm from a different planet. Why are we not all seeing this? To drop everything and spend a week as a church in prayer should be normal. What do you mean, like weekly from 7 p.m.? Hush with all of that. We need another graphic in an email? They didn't have those things in the early church. What I'm talking about is the Spirit of God moving upon a people to help be vehicles of revival in a city, in a region. It should be normal for us to organically say, we're going to gather and pray, and we're not going to leave until God lets us leave. And we're praying all day, and we're praying all night, and we're pressing in. This is normal Christianity. I'm praying that we can get to places throughout this year where we redefine what it means to be the church. But when I'm talking about a house of prayer, I'm talking about the Spirit of God moving upon a group of people and evoking them to pray. Because there has never been one movement in the history of humanity that did not start with a prayer movement. Whenever revival hit the generations before us, they never had an intention for revival. Their intention was, we are going to radically pursue heaven and we are going to pray. And God moved upon a people to pray. We can hardly pray an hour in the West. In our personal lives, we can hardly pray stoplight prayers. We don't know what it means to tarry in the place of prayer and to set aside an hour and to set aside 2 hours and pray and to intercede. We need divine intervention. And when your prayer life isn't where it needs to be, that is the beginning of your prayer life. I don't have passion to pray. Then pray that. Pray for passion. Do you know how much time I spend praying, God, would you give me a grace for prayer? Would you give me a hunger for prayer? Would you give me longevity in prayer? I want to be able to stand longer in the place of prayer. Because every man of God that I admire in their ministry, I can hardly find anyone in our generation. These are the old time revivalists. All of them, what they would say is before they would preach, they would spend 3 to 4 hours with the Lord in prayer. They could not ever imagine approaching this place and speaking to a people on behalf of a holy God without saturating themselves in prayer. Before they would have their tent meetings in the second Great Awakening in America, before they'd have those tent meetings, they would say that they would spend an entire weekend praying for the lost and praying for the word to come forth and praying. And then, therefore, when they had the tent meetings, thousands of people are giving their life to Jesus. There's mega evangelism happening and people are coming to the Lord and there's healings. But behind all of those things, you will always find miraculous testimonies of a praying people who would dedicate hours of their time to the place of prayer. And it's a move of God. Here's the yes that we have to give. Number one, as a people, if we're going to be a house of prayer, there's a yes to the secret place. In Matthew chapter 6, Jesus says, when you fast, don't do it like this. Your Father who sees in private will reward you openly. When you pray, don't do it like this. Don't do it for people to see. But go and be alone with the Father. And your Father who hears and sees in private will reward you openly. We see that there's this principle for the life of a believer to say yes to this specific type of prayer, and that is yes to your own secret place. Jesus practiced this in his life, didn't he? He revealed to us his devotion to the private place. And Peter, James, and John didn't come with him to that private place, did he? The apostles didn't go with, the crowds didn't go with him. He served the crowds, but Scripture makes sure that we see that almost every single day of his life, he would escape to the secret place and no one would see him. It wasn't for the eyes of people, and he would devote himself to the secret place, time with the Father, intimacy with the Father. And the Father who sees in private would reward him openly with healings. What we want is we want the open reward without the private devotion. Well, look at Jesus was healing Jesus, but those were the reward for a devotion to the private place. If you are a believer, you have a responsibility to devote yourself to the secret place with the Father. Why? Because the Father desires to be with you individually in your alone time with Him. This doesn't look like, so Father, I just pray that you bless me today and you be with my kids. And Father, I just honor your name in Jesus. We just pray as I'm about to be late. This is crazy. I pray right now that you would, and Father, I'm going to have to speed right now. Would you just hide me? Y'all prayed it before. I'm not the only one. Father, would you help me break the law right now in Jesus? Just hide me. Just hide me. Just hide me. You know I got to do it today, right? So we pray and listen, we're praying on our way to somewhere else. Can I say that's not the call? I'm praying on the way to my job. I'm praying on the way to my family. I'm praying. You're not called to pray on the way. Those will be a part of your life. But if you don't have moments where you stop everything, my job doesn't matter, dinner doesn't matter right now. I have this time dedicated to the Father. You say, I don't have time. Who gave you time in the first place? I'm sick of it. Let's talk about it. Who gave you time in the first place? Who gave you breath in the first place? There's no excuse. Did you know that your time is not your time? You are a steward of what has been given to you. It is His time. And I believe in a tithe as a principle. Tithe time. Take the first portion. You say, I just don't have time. You can't wake up earlier? You're not hungry. You have a slothful spirit. I'm sorry. Are we streaming? This ain't... You have a slothful spirit and you don't know it. You are under the power of a slothful religious spirit in our region, and it's time to break through. And when you break through, it's then and only then that you see the contrast. It's then and only then that you begin to see, wait a minute, I went all of those years. I could have been waking up at 5 a.m. praying for the power of God and going to my work and see miracles happen and I could have been seeing my family restored. What have I been doing with my time? There's a yes that you are called to give that I can't give for you. But when you stand before Jesus, that's between you and Him. There's a yes to prayer that you are called to give in your life. Now, we're not going to make it. This is the second yes. The yes is to corporate prayer. The yes is to corporate prayer. Can I venture on to say that for the believer, I don't think corporate prayer is optional? Is that foreign in America right now? Is that weird to say? My mind just doesn't see how it is. Well, it's just, you know what I'm saying? If I got time. What? That doesn't make sense to me. Do you tell your job that? Do you think your work there is optional? You think your responsibility and your place there is optional? No, we are a body that has one assignment in the earth. And it's not to build a good career, and it's not to build a beautiful family. Those things will accompany it. The call is an assignment to bring God's glory to the earth, and we are in this assignment together. And if we understand that if we're going to do this, it's going to require prayer, guess what? Every believer has a voice in the place of prayer. When you come into the room to pray, all of a sudden more angels show up. When you lift your voice and pray, there's another strand. I believe right now, because corporate prayer is lagging in our nation, we are not getting the strength that we need to break through chains. There's something about joining together corporately. There's a Satanist that was converted into Christianity, and now he gives his testimony, and as a result of his testimony, he has a lot of things about the kingdom of darkness. And part of his testimony that I'll never forget is he would leave his body, he would travel through the night, and he would be working for the enemy through the night. He'd put curses on stoplights, so wrecks would be there. These things are real. These things really do happen. And he would, do certain things. He would go in and he said, but I would remember from time to time, I'd travel and we'd go into a certain neighborhood and we would not have access into that neighborhood. In the spirit, we would look down and there'd be a group of Christians holding hands praying in that neighborhood. We'd have to pass over that neighborhood. This thing is real. People are dying around us and the church isn't praying yet. We're watching COVID numbers climb. And we're okay with that? We got a call. I was in a meeting and last week, and the call was, hey, he put it on speakerphone so we could all hear it. And the call was, hey, we're trying to get your father to a hospital because of certain health issues and this. And he said, but all of them are full. There's no capacity. We're just going to have to pray. This is the condition of our nation. And yet, if a pandemic doesn't evoke the church to turn Netflix off, to push the burger aside and pray, where have we come? Somebody say house of prayer. It means time is irrelevant in a house of prayer. We're not praying with the clock, we're praying with results, and we're going to pray until we feel breakthrough. We're going to pray until we see breakthrough. The last thing is a house of revival. Everybody say house of revival. We have a broken understanding of revival. We think revival is signs and miracles and healing. That is not revival. Revival is not signs and healings. Those things may accompany revival. but they themselves are not revival. So then what is revival? Revival is hearts turning back to God. At the core of what revival is, it's hearts turning back to God. Now, we've gotten word after word after word about physical healings, about miracles that would be produced, but that's not what we're pursuing. Now, it is called to be a part of the kingdom, but I want to share with you 3 layers. Pull up those 3 layers. There's 3 layers to revival. Number 1, it begins with this. It begins with renewal. Everybody say renewal. This is probably the phase we're in and we need to be in right now. That's when God touches the heart of a single individual. Christians individually need renewal. When God would come in and touch your heart, when God would come in and touch your life, when God would come in and touch your family, He begins to fill your family. Because can I tell you, the strength of our corporate gathering is only as strong as our individual renewals. If we got 5 people on fire, then we're going to be sitting around that size of a fire. But when each person is cultivating their own personal renewal, when they show up, they're bringing the fullness of the kingdom to wherever they're at. And can you imagine 30, 40, 50, 60 people who are on fire with God? They've had their own personal renewal with the Lord. They've been praying in their In their secret place. They've said yes to that. So now when we show up, everybody has a prophetic word. Somebody has a word of encouragement. Somebody has the kingdom to offer when we gather corporately. But you know what? We've made this. There's a man on the stage and there's a team on the stage and we come and sit. Here is my responsibility. Let me just go through. Can we just do it? Let's go through the Western Christian responsibility in a nutshell. Check. Shake a hand. Smile. It's time for worship. Worship's over. It's time to give. Check. It's time to listen. You think we're going to change a city like that? It's going to take us to dig. It's going to take believers knowing their role, knowing that they're priest. Now you say, well, then what does it look like if it doesn't look like that? Well, this specific gathering may look very similar, but it's about what's happening on the inside of believers, because this somehow can be much different than this, based upon the posture of our hearts. What I'm saying is when we're filled with the kingdom, when we do this, the worship is different. We're praying through the service. We're looking around saying, God, what are you saying? Is there anybody that needs the healing? Because right now, if it doesn't flow through a microphone and a stage, nobody's going to get anything. But I believe the miracles aren't going to come from a stage in our generation. I believe they're not going to come from a man in our generation. I believe it's going to come from someone having discernment saying, can I pray for you? I just feel like, and healing would move through this individual and touch her body and touch her organs and touch her bones. But it's going to require what? Individual renewal with the Lord. The second phase of that is revival. And this is when God touches a community of faith. And I've not witnessed revival in my life. So that's at least 30 years. I don't know what revival will look like in Real Life Church. But when revival hits, everything begins to change. Something is moving. People are getting healed. People are getting breakthroughs. People are falling in love with Jesus. The lost are being saved because evangelism is always a part of revival. And we're doing baptism after baptism. And that's what revival will begin to look like. And the third phase is awakening. And this is when the wider society is impacted. We can't reach our city until we have revival in our churches, until we're awakened in our churches. And as we're awakened and we sustain that revival, we'll see it touch the city. So what is our responsibility when we're talking about a house of revival? We're not pressing in for miracles. We're not pressing in for signs and wonders. If I had time, I would read scriptures. As we're going through this Bible reading plan, we're seeing that it was the nature. Everywhere Jesus went, it wasn't just a percentage that got healed. Every single person that was sick got healed. Every single person possessed by the enemy was delivered. and then he dies, he resurrects, and then his church does the same exact thing. They would bring the sick. You know what it should look like after this gathering, because we've been in here in the presence of the Lord. We've been around the throne room of heaven. We've been getting strengthened and cultivated. Sick people should be waiting outside the door. What if the hospitals need to fill for the church to say, you know what? I don't think we're doing our responsibility. We're putting all this weight on nurses in the healthcare system.
Exactly.
What if it takes that? What if it takes a crisis in healthcare for believers to say, you know what? I think we've been sitting on some power, because they were healing leprosy. The dead were being raised. They were seeing it, and we are part of the same kingdom. Why are we okay with not seeing it? Why are we cruising through this pandemic? I haven't heard any testimonies yet of people are traveling from all over, not to get tested, but it seems as if healing is breaking out in this region of Oklahoma, and we're getting the test results. Now, we're not even talking about cancer yet. We're just talking about a virus. We're not even talking about a disease yet, but the power that we have on the inside of us doesn't just heal disease. It doesn't just heal viruses and bacteria. It heals diseases. It raises the dead. And either that's true or it's not. If it's not, I just want to pack up and go home. But what is our responsibility when we're talking about a revival culture? Our responsibility is cultivating a culture of revival. And can I tell you, it's going to take some work. It's going to take more than just coming in here and singing some songs and just being together on Sundays. It's going to require us to dig until we hit the wells of healing, to dig until we hit the power that we need to hit. It's going to take corporate action to get to these places. Everybody say environment. That is our responsibility. Is the environment conducive for healing to break out? Because no matter what, you're not going to grow an orange tree here. And you can water it all you want. And you can pray for God to cause it to grow all you want. But that water cannot supersede the environment the seed has been planted in. Environment dictates everything. So what we are saying when we're talking about a revival culture is our diligence to build, establish, cultivate, and maintain an environment that is conducive for revival. We don't have to focus on healings, but what we want to do is we want to create and sustain an environment that if someone comes in and they're sick, the environment demands the gospel to bring healing to their bodies. Right now, the environment is not demanding healing. People can come in sick and leave sick. I'm not okay with that. Are you? I'm not okay with that anymore when we are carrying the power of the gospel on the inside of us. I believe that if people come in sick, they should walk out healed. If that's not what we're a part of, then what in the world are we a part of? I believe if people walk in with depression, they shouldn't leave with that depression. You think 3 songs in a sermon is going to do that? My heart is even more broken to say people walk in with demons, and the demons lifted their hands with them, and they walk out still possessed. How dare our churches get so cold that demons would even feel welcomed? They should tremble and speak out in worship. Jesus of Nazareth, what do you have with us? And then all the believers say, hold up, what? You have been exposed. But if darkness is not being exposed, we ain't looking for it, but we should walk in a level of power that if I get close enough, come on somebody, if I get close enough, demons are going to shake if they're there. Just want to see. Come and give me a hug. Just want to see. Is anything shaking? No, you good. You good. I just want to see, right? We just want to see, right? This is revival culture. Why everybody leaning back? I'm just an illustration. That's all it is. I believe God has called us to be that for this region. We're different for a reason. I preach different for a reason. Y'all still rocking with me. Y'all ain't, Why? Because there's something in the message that we carry that is needed. For decades, I tried to bury this message. It is not, they're going to hang me, but I can't bury this. This is the message that we carry for the region. We're never going to stop saying, there is more in you. Stop being lazy, rise up. It's time to pray. It's time to dive. We're never going to stop. We're never going to stop until we become the church that Jesus bled for. Somebody say culture of revival. We can see miracles again. What is COVID? What is quarantine? Now, I'm not saying don't do that now, have wisdom, because we ain't got power. But I want to tap into the power where we ain't got a quarantine because it's come here instead of go home. We can do that, but it's going to require us to lean into heaven. It's going to require us to pray. Can you stand up? And I want you to get the vision. Underneath your feet, there are wells of power. Underneath your feet, there are wells of revival. Underneath your feet, there are wells and streams of healing that the earth needs right now. But we have to rise up to our call to be a house of worship, consecration, holiness, surrender, a house of prayer, and a house of revival.